Hey guys, Jordan here from BDS Suspension. As you can see, we have a few different Rams in here, but I'm going to be talking about this one in particular. This is a 21 Dodge Ram Rebel, and I'm going to be kind of going through step by step on how to install our BDS 6-inch lift system. Now your first step after putting the truck up on the hoist and getting your wheels and tires off is you're going to go ahead and take your 22mm socket and remove your tie rod. So you can see that the tie rod just popped out of there, and sometimes you might have to give it a whack with a hammer or a traditional pickle fork to be able to get the tie rod out of here, but here we got lucky enough that it just comes out. Now that you have your tie rod removed from your knuckle, you're going to go ahead and just swing that back out of the way, and you're going to remove your two caliper bolts, and you just use your 21mm socket. And be careful not to let that caliper fall, so you don't want to stretch that line out or damage that brake line there. So just make sure you have a hook here or a bungee cord or whatever you have that will be able to support that. Just go ahead and hang it on there. Just make sure you have adequate slack there, and you're good with that step. Now your next step is going to go ahead and take your 36mm socket and remove this hub bearing nut here. That's just going to allow for that to push back when we drop this out of the way here. So now that you have that nut removed, you're going to go ahead and remove the upper ball joint nut, and you want to be careful. You'll take your 21mm socket, and what I like to do is not take it off all the way. Sometimes you get lucky and that ball joint will just pop right out of that knuckle taper, but in this case we won't. So go ahead and leave that on there, and you're going to watch right here and right here. When you hit the knuckle, make sure you don't hit the ball joint, hit the knuckle, and you'll watch this pop up and this pop up. So you see how that popped up. So now what you can do is you can go ahead and take your pry bar and just push down on the spring on that arm, and remove your nut the rest of the way, and just allow that to come up, and then just push that back. Make sure that you're not going to pull those boots off, and you should be clear for now. Now that you have your upper ball joint disconnected from your knuckle, you're going to go ahead and remove this Torx bolt right here, and all this does is just hold this rotor on to the hub of the knuckle. You're going to go ahead and take your T30 Torx bit and make sure that you don't strip this out, because it's pretty easy to strip it out. Just go ahead and loosen that, and this rotor will want to fall right off. Take that off. Set it aside for the time being. So now that you got your rotor removed, that allows you access for your ABS wire here, and it's just a little Allen bolt, and you're going to take your 5mm Allen socket here, and once again be careful not to strip those out. And just remove that, and just remove that part from the bearing, and just pull that through, allow that to dangle there. So now your next step is you're going to go ahead and remove your sway bar link nut on the bottom of this arm here. So it's right there. You're just going to go ahead and use your 18mm socket and get that on there. And I already loosened and took off the other side, and just maybe pry up and get that out of your arm there. Now that you got your link disconnected from your arm, you're going to go ahead and remove these two bolts on each side of that sway bar, and you're just going to use a 15mm socket. And obviously be careful once you loosen one side at a time, because this one will want to drop. And then go ahead and do this side, and go ahead and just make sure you have your arm on it when you do loosen it, because like I said, it's obviously going to want to drop. And just kind of finagle its way out of there. You might have to have somebody assist you if you have the ability with that. But now that you have your sway bar and your sway bar links removed out of your way, you're going to go ahead and take your 24mm sockets, and you're going to see on each side of these arms there's some cam bolts, and you can only loosen one side, and that's the nut side. So those are just some clear zinc nuts. So you're going to go ahead and loosen, do not remove. Your other side as well. You'll kind of see those cams shift as you loosen them. You can do as much as you want, but just make sure you don't remove it. So now we're going to go ahead and remove your strut bolt and nut. Now there's a couple different ways you can do this. You remember that we loosened those nuts on those cams. So once you take this bolt out, all of this is going to want to swing out, and you want to pull this out of this hub bearing because you don't want that to pull that boot out and then have to try to put it back in there because it's a pain. Or what you could do is you can remove the lower ball joint nut and pop this off of here and get this knuckle off of here and swing it out of the way. But either way, it's fine either way, but we're just going to go ahead and do it this way. So go ahead and take your 24mm wrench on your nut side, 21mm socket on your bolt side, and pull up on this arm a little bit. Remove that bolt. You can see everything wants to swing down. So just go ahead and make sure you push that CV out of that spline and just let that swing there. Now that you have all that swung out of the way, we're going to go ahead and take our 16mm wrench and remove these 3 nuts on top of the strut studs here. Once you remove those 3 nuts, just go ahead and pull that baby out and set her aside. So when you remove the strut on the driver's side, it's just a little bit different than it is on the passenger side. You can kind of see as Nate comes in here, these little clips that just go over those studs on the strut. Go ahead and just, what I like to do, you can use a screwdriver, whatever you got. Take a pry bar and just pop those guys up right there. Sometimes they can be a pain, but just get them out of your way, and that wire harness will go out of your way, and you can get your wrench on there and loosen those nuts. Now you have your strut removed and everything kind of dangling here. Like I said, you can do this a couple different ways. You can, if you wanted to be He-Man, you can go ahead and remove these nuts, remove these cam bolts, and drop all this out of the way. But what I like to do here is I like to take your 24mm socket and remove the lower ball joint nut right here, as you can see on each side. And be careful since it is sitting like this, that it doesn't pop off that ball joint and that taper, because it's just going to want to slide right off. So since you have this non-threaded area here, what I like to do is just hold this up and give it a couple whacks. It just slides right off of there. Now that you got your knuckle removed from your lower arm, you're going to go ahead and remove these nuts now, and just make sure that those cams are in the slot so it doesn't just sit there and spin on you. Then you'll have to push the whole cam itself through each side, and on the back side here, and they can come in. If it's rolled up this way, you won't be able to get it out because of the CV. Just make sure it's rolled down and pulls right out. And on this side, you don't have anything to worry about. Just pull it out and remove that lower arm there. Now that you got your lower arm removed, our next step is going to go ahead and remove these 4 bolts here that hold this skid plate on. So you just take a 16mm socket and remove each one. Make sure it doesn't fall on your head or anything. So now your next step, since you got that skid plate removed, is you're going to go ahead and remove these bolts here that hold that rear cross member in. And on the nut side, on the back side, is an 18mm wrench you're going to have to use for your nut. And then for the front side, just go ahead and use a 15mm socket on that bolt head. Make sure your hardware is out of the way, and just pull each one of those bolts and remove that cross member. Now that you have your cross member removed, before you're going to start working on getting your differential out, we're going to go ahead and remove these CVs from the differential. And as you can see, it's just basically a spline in there, female and male. So, and I don't like to use an actual metal hammer. I just like to use this, or like anything soft that you have, or you can even use a pry bar and pop it out of there. What I like to do is just hold this up and catch that lip, and it just slides right out of there. Then you're going to disconnect your front drive shaft, and you're just going to take a 15mm socket and disconnect all 4 bolts. And sometimes they like to just clamp on there by themselves, so you're just going to have to take a mallet and just whack that off of that. But then once you get that removed, just go ahead and use a bungee cord and just hang it up out of the way and just hook it on something up top so it's not in your way when you take your front diff out. Now, the first step you're going to do to remove your differential is you're going to go ahead and disconnect this wire harness on here. So there's a clip that bolts in right there on the frame, and then right here on this little bracket. I already removed those. And you see this little red tab right here that clicks in and out. So to get this harness out, I'm going to go ahead and slide that back right there. And then right where you slid that out, you're going to go just push down and pull that off of there. So now your next step to go ahead and get the differential out is you're going to go ahead and, what I like to do is loosen all the hardware first, and then you'll get a jack stand underneath here and help you kind of support you and then remove your drive shaft. But first I'm going to show you kind of where all this hardware is at and loosen it all up. So these first two we're going to do are kind of the most difficult ones. So I'll have Nate kind of swing in here, kind of right back there by my finger. You can kind of see it on there, right there. We're going to go ahead and remove those, or loosen I should say, and you're just going to use your 18mm socket, and I just use a 3/8 ratchet. And since the spot that they are in, I kind of have a pain getting them on there. So go ahead and get that on there. And then I like to grab just a breaker bar, or a piece of pipe or whatever you got, and just loosen those up. And eventually you'll be able to just start threading those out pretty easily. Now that you got those upper two loosened, you're gonna go ahead and loosen these two on the passenger side. They're just two bolts right here. And this bracket, once you loosen this, will just want to swing around, but when you remove those bolts, just move that out of the way. And same thing, just take your 18mm socket and break it loose. A couple turns each bolt, and just be careful of that wire harness there. Don't want to hit it too much. Now that you got your passenger sides loosened, you're going to go ahead and loosen your driver sides. Now, same thing, just 18mm socket, and these ones obviously are a little bit harder of a spot, so just try and get your ratchet or whatever you got on there. Like I said, it's just all a matter of the angles you got and the tools you got here. So now your next step to get the differential out is you're going to go ahead and remove all your bolts. You first loosen them, now you're going to remove them. So I advise that you remove these top two up here that were kind of a pain by the oil pan there. And then those are just the hardest ones to get to, so everything is still kind of tight. You can loosen those ones to get those out pretty easily. So we're going to go ahead and loosen and remove these three right here. And I'm just going to use my air ratchet here. So now just make sure that once you remove all three of those bolts on the back side, that it's just well supported with your trans stand or whatever you got. And you give it to your buddy on that side. You're going to remove those two bolts on that side. So now you can kind of do this one of two ways. You can either just kind of finagle out of there with this trans jack, and I just like to use this just for support, and they're not really that heavy if you have a buddy. So what we're going to go ahead and do is remove this jack and just kind of muscle our way out of it. Once we get it out of the way, just make sure that you clear this rear control arm pocket here. So we're going to keep going down a little bit. Make sure you don't get caught on that. And then what I like to do, you can either leave it up there, like I said, since they're pretty light, just drop it down so you don't have a chance of dropping it off that jack. So now that you got your front differential out, we're gonna go ahead and make some clearance cuts for those new crossmembers that we're gonna install. So your first cut is you're gonna come over to your driver's side rear control arm pocket, and you see this cam slot right here, right on the edge. You're gonna measure 1 3/4 just over, and then down, and then up, and then go about halfway. And on the back side, you're gonna do the exact same thing. There's another cam slot, and you're just gonna go 1 3/4, and you're just gonna connect those two lines and just make a vertical cut all the way nice. On this side, you're gonna measure from this part right here in about 3 inches. You're gonna see right about where that bend starts to kind of happen. And then you're gonna do the exact same thing on the back side, but your cuts are not gonna be completely vertical on top. So on this front side here, this front face, when you go up, you're gonna have to kind of make about a 45-degree angle to connect it. So you're basically gonna cut, angle, and then cut across. So you're gonna kind of have a little bit of a step there when you cut that. Now that you have your cuts marked out, we're gonna go ahead and make the cuts. Now, if you don't feel comfortable doing this part, make sure that you have a trained professional or somebody who is comfortable enough doing these cuts. And you can kind of use whatever cutting tool you have. We recommend a Sawzall just because it's a nice, clean, smooth cut, but you can use a cutoff wheel or a plasma cutter, whatever you have. So I like to do this driver's side cut first. And what I like to do is I like to either take a cutoff wheel, whatever you have, and start a little cut notch, because sometimes with these, they just like to flop all over the place and not get a straight cut at first. So if you have that, you can kind of put that blade in that notch and kind of just continue that down. And it is a little bit of a pain just because of almost the angle that this is on, because it's kind of rounded here. But just make sure that you have
gloves and eye protection on when you do this. So you can see kind of how I'm about a third of the way with that cut. I'm continuing with that line. And if you go on either side of that line, it's not a huge deal because we do give you a pretty good margin for error, but you are going to want to clean it up with a grinder. So if you do happen to have your crossmember run into that, just grind it off a little bit and that should make plenty enough clearance for you. So I'm going to keep cutting, just follow that line straight. Now that you have your driver's side cut, we're going to go ahead and cut our passenger side. Now, since this isn't as big as a cut as it is on the driver's side, I just like to use this air cutoff wheel here. If you don't have an air cutoff wheel, use like a regular grinder. And so I'm going to go ahead and just follow our line that we made earlier and just kind of make that nice and clean as I can. Just because, as you can see, because you have that little angle cut there, it's a little hard to do with the Sawzall. So I'm just going to cut it with this air one here and just kind of angle it and then just finish it all the way down through. Now that you have both your cuts made, you're going to go ahead and take your angle grinder, whatever kind of grinder you got, and we're going to go ahead and just smooth those out and make them nice and flush with each other on each side. And then afterwards, we're going to go ahead and paint any exposed metal that you took the paint off while cutting. So now that you got your cuts made and everything painted up and grinded, we're going to go ahead and start installing our differential drop brackets. Now, you can kind of do this in any order you want, but I just like starting on this side. And you're going to start with this VU looking one. And you're just going to take your factory bolts. You're going to put it on this front face here and put it right there with the factory bolts. And see how these are kind of bent in a little bit? You just want to make sure that this is all kind of bent that right way. And just start your bolts and just hand tighten them for the time being, so it's easier once we go to put our differential in. Now that you have that passenger side bracket in, we're going to go ahead and install this center driver side bracket. So you can see that it's two plates and that they're bent. So the best way is to just make sure they're lined up and bent the right way, and you can see how it has the opening. So that's where your differential is going to slide in at. And you're going to go ahead and take your factory bolts, and you can see, and Nate will swing around here, this factory mount right here. And you're just going to go ahead and put your bolts in there. And once again, just hand tighten them. Do not hit them with your impact of your ratchet yet. And then that one's installed. So now your last differential bracket that you need to install is this driver side rear one. So you're going to go ahead and see, it's that nice bracket there. And you're going to see this gusset plate right here. You're going to make sure that's towards the front of the vehicle, as in towards the headlights facing the front. So you're going to take your new 1/2-inch hardware we provide, put it through the factory holes there, washers and nuts. Now that you have all your brackets in, we're going to go ahead and grab a buddy. That's our buddy. We're going to go ahead and throw the differential up into the vehicle. So the easiest way to do this is, you obviously, with this plate right here, you put that in between that one, and we do give you new hardware here. You want to go ahead and just throw those in there, and just put your washers and nuts on just so they don't slide out. And the reason we do this side first is because on this middle part here, we use some spacers in between those two plates. So while your buddy holds this up, just make sure that you get the spacer on the front side, and then the spacer goes in between, this little spacer right here, in between the bracket and the differential. So through. Now that you have your two middle front ones done, you're going to go ahead and see this plate back here. We give you new hardware as well for these. And just thread these 3 bolts into their homes, and that's why we leave this stuff loose, is so you can kind of maneuver it a little bit as you wish. So now that you have your differential into all your brackets, we're going to go ahead and torque all of our brackets down. Now on this upper one right here, just go ahead and use your 18mm socket with on your factory bolts, and This tool doesn't really meet the torque specification for this, so just make sure that you get a hand ratchet on there and just bump them up a little bit more. And on these bottom ones, it's a 19mm socket with a 19mm wrench. Now that you have your passenger side brackets tight, we're gonna go ahead and do this 3 gusset bracket here. And I like to do the bolts that go through the frame that hold it on to the differential first. So we're gonna go ahead and use your air ratchet here. Again, 19mm sockets. Now that you have the frame nuts and bolts tightened, you're gonna go ahead and tighten the bolts that go into the diff. Now same thing, just another 19mm socket. Now, our last differential mount that we need to tighten is this center one here. And you can see that there's just these 2 bolts up here, the factory bolts, where the factory location, that we need to tighten up still. And then also these bottom 2 that go through the differential. So these are just still your 18mm sockets. So just make sure you can get that on there. And like I said, they are kind of a pain, but just make sure that you get enough torque on them. And if you feel like you haven't, what you can maybe do is get a wrench with another wrench on it, kind of use it for leverage to get it more torqued down. But with this, I'll probably just grab a pipe, use that to torque it. Now your final steps to tighten all these differential bolts is we're gonna go ahead and tighten these 2 middle ones. And if you can, go ahead and make sure that you tighten it on the nut side so you can get more torque that way. Now we're gonna go ahead and plug our wiring harness back in, and you might have to disconnect a couple more clips to be able to gain adequate slack to be able to plug that in. So just anything that's up there that's clipped in, just try to unplug it and just plug that back in, and make sure you press that red button back in, and then just make sure you have enough slack here. Should be good to go. Now that you have all your differential mounts torqued, we're gonna go ahead and install our front cross member. Now when installing the front cross member, it's pretty simple to install it, but just a good rule of thumb is that it offsets forward every single time. So see how this part is flat and this part offsets forward? So this part always will face the front of the truck on each of our rears and our front of our cross members. So go ahead and grab your cross member and install it into the vehicle, into the lower arm pockets. So now, I'll show you once I get these installed. You can see on these cams, and I'll show you on one of these right here in the light. Now you see this little cutout here on this cam. Now what this does is determine what offset you have while installing your cross member. So this would be centered, and then left and right. So on these ones it's hard to see, but these are centered up on this, and they fit pretty darn well here. And just make sure that when doing it, that each one is the same way. Now that you got your front cross member installed, we're gonna go ahead and install our rear cross member as well. These kind of go the same way. You wanna make sure that the bolts on the front run front to rear, and the same way with the rear ones. You wanna run them front to rear, because you don't want any chance of the nut here on this part hitting that CV. So we're gonna go ahead and grab this cross member. Always easier with the buddy, but if not, work with what you got. And then same thing, just make sure that your notches are facing the same way on each side. And like this, these ones are off-centered. Now that you got both cross members installed, we're gonna go ahead and take our skid plate and mount it up on each cross member. And you can just see that there's just 2 holes with nuts inside of them. So go ahead and just, you don't want to tighten these up yet. Now before that you can torque your crossmember bolts, we're gonna go ahead and install our lower arm into those pockets on the cross members. So you want to take your factory cam bolts, pick up your factory lower arm, and slide it into place. Now each one of these bolts, the cam bolts, run from front to rear. Your backside parts of your cams and your nuts on them so they don't fall out. Now that you got your lower arms in, you're gonna go ahead and torque all 4 of your crossmember mounting bolts. So you got a 27mm socket, and if you don't have a 27mm wrench, an 1 1/16 will work, or just a crescent wrench. Doesn't really matter. And you wanna make sure when you tighten those, that those cams are in those slots there, but they should fall into place pretty easily. Now your next step is you're gonna go ahead and install the provided drive shaft spacer. Now this really only gets installed one way. You can kind of see how each one of them is machined. This one's machined in, and you can see this little lip here on this drive shaft, or on this differential here. You're gonna go ahead and just set that on there. And just line up your holes there. And then same way with here, you're just gonna go ahead and you can kind of push that back a little bit and just fight it a little bit and just kind of find home wherever your holes are. You'll kind of feel it just click in once it gets there. And make sure that you do Loctite these bolts, because there is no locking mechanism, and these are very important bolts. And make sure that you hurry up and tighten those before that Loctite dries. 19mm socket, go ahead and throw that on there and just rotate it. So your next step is, after you got your drive shaft spacer in, you can see this little plastic trim guard here for your linkage. So you're gonna go ahead and see how that spins, and that just rubs against that. So some of them you will not have to trim, but on this case we do have to trim. And you can just take like a razor blade and heat it up and cut it. But we have this nice little, and you're just gonna kind of trim to make some clearance there. Now you're gonna go ahead and install your BDS badge. Now you can kind of do this whenever you want. When you get all your parts, you can install it then. It doesn't really matter when you install it. It's just, I like to install it while it's up in the air and it's being held up by the vehicle. And then also I just do it now, because if I don't do it, I might forget it. Now your next step is you're gonna go ahead and take your provided strut spacer and set it on top of your strut. Now these only go on one way, and you can kind of see, I'll show you here, basically how this is laid out. And you basically see that little nipple on that. That basically goes on the front with that first one. Make sure that sits on there. And you're gonna use your original factory hardware on this part right here, on these studs with these nuts. And you can tighten these down once you get these hand started. Now that you got your strut spacer installed, we're gonna go ahead and install the strut into the vehicle with the new 10mm hardware. And just make sure that you put the right strut on the right side. Now, I want to mention something about these strut spacers. Since it is a 6-inch Rebel, we do offer you a preload spacer. So if you do decide to install that preload spacer, you're gonna get 3/8 of an inch low if you do not install it. But if you do install it, you're gonna get a 1/2 inch high in your front. So you'll be sitting 3/8 of an inch low if you do not install it, 1/2 inch high in your front if you do install it. But that is just for these Rebels. And so, but we do have that in directions, so just make sure you follow the directions when it comes to that step. Now your next step is you're going to want to transfer over your wheel bearing and your dust shield over to your new BDS knuckle. So we're going to go ahead and just remove these 3 bolts here that hold your bearing onto your knuckle. And it's just a 21mm socket. And then what I like to do is I just like to keep them kind of the same where they're at. And a lot of times they are a tight fit, but this one just comes right up. And go ahead and grab your new knuckle, line up the bolt holes, and then make sure that you use red Loctite on your bolts. And you want to start each one of these by hand. Now that you have your bearing swapped over to your new knuckle, we're going to go ahead and install the knuckle into the lower arm.
And it is easier if you have a buddy, but my buddies are busy. And just let that dangle there, and then go ahead and take your 24mm socket and tighten it up. Now when you install these CVs, you want to make sure that these snap rings right here that you can see I'm kind of moving back and forth are seated kind of flush with that, because if they're up one way or up the other way, you won't be able to install this CV. So if it's up, it'll just sit there and bounce back your CV, but once it's flush with those splines, you'll be able to just kind of drive it in. And it should be, once you get it in, you'll be able to feel it just kind of go in nice and smooth. Now all you want to do is just make sure that you line those splines up a little bit and just give it a couple pops. Now we can kind of begin to assemble this as we move forward. So what I like to do is, since I got that knuckle hanging there with that arm, is just swoop that up and then just make sure that that CV goes into that bearing where those splines are at, and then just keep pulling up. And what I like to do is throw that in there and kind of help support everything, so you're not sitting there fighting everything trying to get it hooked up to here. So now what you can do is you can go ahead and make sure those splines are lined up, kind of get them into their groove. And you might have a hard time pushing this down, but just make sure that you get enough thread showing where you can tighten that or snug that nut up on there. Now there's a couple different ways you can do this. It doesn't really matter what you tighten here, but we're going to need to tighten the upper ball joint and then these upper strut nuts here. So I'm going to go ahead and do the strut nuts first. And this is just a 17mm socket or wrench, whatever you would like to use here. Now your next step is you're going to want to go ahead and tighten your upper ball joint nut. That's just your 21mm socket. And just tighten that up, make sure it's nice and snug on there. Now you can just go ahead and put your CV nut on there and just use your 36mm socket. And now before you do that, you just want to make sure that your CV is in those bearing splines the right way, which it should be. If it pops out that much, it should be in there correctly, but you just want to make sure that it's not all bound up in there. Now before you start assembling your brake stuff here, we're going to go ahead and route this ABS wire to the back side of the knuckle, and you can kind of see here on this dust shield that there's a cutout for that to come through. Go ahead and throw that through there. And then just lock that in place, and then make sure you grab your Allen bolt, that factory. Make sure you do Loctite it. Just be careful that you don't want to strip that out. It doesn't need to be too tight, but just make sure it's tight enough. Now you can start to assemble your brake stuff. So you're going to go ahead and slap your rotor back on. And remember, we do have this Torx bolt here. You can reinstall it if you want to. It's not that big of a deal. It just helps snug that rotor up there, so when you go to put your caliper on, you don't have to fight your rotor and your caliper. So just go ahead and put that back on there and grab your T30 Torx bit. Now your next step is you're just going to go ahead and throw your caliper on here and make sure that your brake pads didn't fall out. Make sure that you're going to grab your 21mm socket. Make sure that you do Loctite these bolts as well. Now we're going to go ahead and remove our factory tie rod end from the vehicle. So the easiest way to do this is just put this in your new knuckle, and you'll need a 24mm wrench or a pipe wrench, whatever you got, and go ahead and just break that nut loose there and just thread that tie rod end off. Now you're going to take your provided tie rod end and you're going to go ahead and thread the factory nut down on the inner tie rod down to where there's about approximately 2 threads left showing. And you're going to take your new tie rod end and just thread that baby in there and just sit it in that hole. And you're going to want to make sure that you put your nut on it. When you do install this, make sure that you do grease it. So we give you a provided grease fitting, so go ahead and put that grease fitting in and do grease it. So your final step for the front is you're going to install your sway bar drop brackets. Now these brackets go on each side, and you can see on this side they're just 2 90-degree bends, and on the back side it is open, and that taper is going to be forward. And you're just going to use your factory hardware on the upper part where that sway bar originally mounted to, and then your 3/8 hardware into the sway bar itself, just mounting to that bracket. And once you get that mounted up on each side, and you'll probably need help doing it just because it's kind of heavy, you'll take these links and you'll just push them into your lower control arm and just use those factory nuts and just tighten those up. You can tighten them in the air on the ground, but it's just easier in the air. All right, now that you're done with your front of your vehicle, you're gonna go ahead and move to the rear. Now your first step is, while it's on the ground, you're supposed to disconnect your track bar. Well, I didn't do that. So we're gonna go ahead and move forward with removing this inner fender. And the reason we remove this is just to give you good clearance and accessibility of getting the shock off when that time comes. So we're gonna go ahead and take our 8mm socket and just remove all these bolts. And once you get it removed, it'll just fall out. And you can see there how you have access to that shock stem now. Now that you got your inner fenders removed, we're gonna go ahead and finally disconnect that track bar. Like I said, I didn't do it on the ground. So you just wanna be careful when you do disconnect this. This is a 21mm socket here. It has a nut tab on the back, so you don't need a wrench on it or anything. So sometimes when you do disconnect these and pull these bolts out, the axle will wanna shift one way. So just be careful and mindful of that. But there we got pretty lucky and not moving. So, and then that track bar's up free out of your way. Your next step is you're gonna go ahead and remove this clip from the frame and this bolt that holds that brake line bracket in. So just take a clip tool or screwdriver, whatever you got, or if you wanna He-Man it, just pull it out, you can. So don't do that, I just broke it. And then go ahead and remove this bolt. It's just a 13mm socket. And that's just gonna allow adequate droop for when you do have to go up and remove everything. Sometimes those do snap, so when that does happen, they're pretty easy to get replaced. It's just really just a Christmas tree zip tie that you can just plug in there. So now that you have your brake line bracket disconnected, if you want, which we recommend, that you go ahead and disconnect the hard line from the bracket that's up there. Nate can kind of show you right where my finger's at. You can disconnect the bracket from, or the clip I should say, from the frame, or just take the hard line out of that clip. And I just like to do it off the frame. And this just, like I said, helps you get more slack when you do need to droop it all out. Now your next step moving forward is you're gonna go ahead and remove the sway bar link from each side. So that bolt right there is just a 16mm socket. Your sway bar is gonna wanna drop out of the way a little bit once you do that. And your bottom nut here on this stud is an 18mm socket. Let's go ahead and remove that. You will not need this link again. So now we're gonna remove our shocks. So we're gonna start on the lower mount here. And it's just a 21mm wrench and socket. And you're just gonna wanna make sure you push it up on your jack stand or whatever you got to be able to remove that bolt. Now before you start to droop everything out to remove your springs, I'm gonna go ahead and just disconnect these clips here on this rear diff, just so you don't stretch those lines out and give them anything to rip on. You can remove as many as you want, as you feel comfortable. So our next step is we're gonna wanna go ahead and remove these springs. So you can do this a couple different ways, and I just went up with the hoist, and here our arms are holding our axle up still a little bit, and I don't want to loosen those quite yet, so we're going to go ahead and just get a pry bar and pry those down if you can. And pull those out of there. Now you're going to go ahead and remove this upper arm bolt on the rear, and it's going to be a 24mm socket on your nut side and a 21mm wrench on your head side, and you might have to get a socket on this part with your impact to help remove this bolt here. Now that you have your upper arm bolt removed, we're gonna go ahead and put our arm relocation bracket in. So now the way this kind of goes in, as you can see, kind of how it's bent. You're gonna have this little gusset towards the center of the vehicle, and you're gonna see these two factory holes right here. You can see these holes on here that are slotted out. You're gonna go ahead and move your arm out of the way, and put those lined up with that hole, and you're gonna put this plate right here on the inside of the original bracket, and then the other part on the outside of that original bracket. You're going to take your 3/8 hardware that we provide for you and put them in to those slots. And now, due to some axle variations, you might have to slot out the axle holes to be able to fit them in there, but in this case they fit pretty well here. And you're going to go ahead and put your nuts and washers on the back side of there. Now that you have that bracket kind of in place there, we're going to go ahead and take our provided sleeve, and you're going to put that on this lower part with these lower holes here. So you're going to take your new provided bolt and put that sleeve in between the two brackets here. And make sure that slides through, and then put your nut and washer on there. Now you can go ahead and reinstall your factory bolt into your upper arm. So all you're going to do is just pull that arm down. And we don't want to tighten this bracket yet. You can see I can kind of maneuver it a little bit as I want. So that little bit of maneuvering will allow you to be able to put your bolt through. You can go ahead and tighten these bolts up. These are 3/8 bolts, so you just need a 9/16 wrench and bolt. And then these are 5/8, so you need a 24mm wrench and socket. And then this you can snug up, but you have to tighten it once you put it on the ground, because those bushings will bind up if you tighten it while it's in the air. Now you can go ahead and install your new provided track bar bracket. Now the way this goes on is kind of like how those arm relocation brackets go on. It sits in between, the original factory spot. So then you're going to go ahead and right here, Nate can show you, here and here there are bolt holes. Right here you can see that that's too small. So you're going to go ahead and have to drill that out to about a 3/8 hole, maybe a little bit bigger, to be able to fit your 3/8 hardware there. So we'll go ahead and do that. Well, a little overkill there, but that's all right. Just allow a little bit more clearance there for you. Now that you got your hole drilled out, you can go ahead and throw your 3/8 hardware there. Then I can have Nate come around and show you here. There's that hole right there at that bend. So go ahead and throw that bolt in there, and then just put your nuts on them. And they can kind of be of a pain just because of how long this bracket is, but just be patient with it. So now that you got your two smaller bolts in, you're going to go ahead and install this new provided bolt with this sleeve. The sleeve's going to go through this track bar bracket here. And you just want to line it up. And it can be kind of a pain just depending on where your bracket falls in. So I had you put the smaller bolts in earlier, and to be able to get this new bolt in the sleeve through properly, you're going to have to take off that back bolt that's on that bend there that sits on the axle. So once you do that, you'll be able to just slide that bolt with that sleeve right in there. And then you just want to make sure that you put that bolt and that nut back in, and then you can tighten that stuff up. Now moving forward, we're going to go ahead and install our bump stop extensions. Now these just sit right on the axle, and you can see kind of how this part's longer here. So they're both going to be offset towards the driver. So both longer parts going to be pointing towards the passenger. You're going to go ahead, and there's just two factory holes here. You're going to go ahead and put that on there. And on the passenger side, since you have room there, we just give you 2 bolts and nuts and washers. And on the driver's side, we're going to come over this way, we give you this little nut tab here. So all you got to do, and Nate will come around and follow me here, all you have to do is slide this nut tab underneath here, find your holes, now you can go ahead and tighten those bump stops extensions. They are just a 1/2 inch socket and wrench. And on this side, all you need to do is use your socket because you have that nut tab there. It might be hard on this one just because of where this is located, so you might have to just use a ratchet or a wrench on it. Now you can go ahead and install your shock. I took the liberty of already removing the factory shock, and also installing our sleeves and bushings. All you need is basically like an arbor press. If you don't have an arbor press, a hammer will work. Also a vise will work really easily, but we have an arbor press, so we just press it in with that. And if you grease it, it helps out a lot more. And then the top here, we have a stem. So we give you 2 washers, 2 bushings, and a nut. So the one washer, it only goes on, it goes on like this. And the other washer will not go over this because it's a little bit bigger, as you can see, than it is on the threads there. So the other washer will not go over. So then you go ahead and put your bushing like that, so it kind of fits in that washer nice. And you can go ahead and just throw it in through your factory hole. And then it needs to go the opposite way while you're installing it. So make sure that that little nipple edge is down. And then same with your washer, just make sure your washer is formed with that bushing, and then install your nut. And then when you tighten this, you can tighten this once you get this bolt in, but once you tighten it, you basically tighten it when those bushings start to swell out, and that's when you know it's good and tight. Now that you have everything almost hooked up, we're gonna go ahead and throw our coil spring in there. So you can see that these have 2 little nipples here, and how this is kind of made out to fit the spring. So these only go on one way. So this one, and you can see up here in the factory holes, there's all kinds of holes here. So this one in particular fits just like that, and just make sure that those nipples have those holes poking through. Sometimes they like to stay, sometimes they don't. So if you get lucky, you can kind of install your spring with it. And you just have to, you might be nice to have a buddy, but just make sure you have enough droop on this, and this is why I haven't gone down far enough, because I don't want to rip that line. Let's go ahead. And He-Man it in there. Now that you got your coil springs in, you can go ahead and install your bottom shock bolt. So it doesn't really matter which way you run this bolt from. Just easier on this side because you can get your impact on this side and be able to torque that nut more. And then up top, it's just a 19mm wrench, and that's what we're going to use here. And then on the bottom, it's just a 21mm socket and wrench. So we'll go ahead and start tightening this up. Remember, until the bushings swell. Now, one of your final steps on the rear is you're going to go ahead and install your sway bar links. Now, we give you bushings and sleeves for these, and the bushings are the same. And then you can see kind of the sleeves, how the inner diameter is different. So you just want to make sure that each sleeve gets, or each sway bar link gets one of those sleeves. So this would be your upper part for your factory bolt. And that's just going to go right into that factory nut tab there. And then on this side, you're going to want to make sure that your sway bar link is on the inside of your sway bar. And then we give you some new hardware for that. So just go ahead and force that up there. And put your nuts and washers on it. So now that you got both sway bar links in, you can go ahead and tighten them down. And remember, this one was just a 16mm socket here. And then on this bottom side here, you'll just need a 19mm socket and wrench. And just do that on each side. Now, one of your final steps is you can go ahead and install this brake line relocation bracket. So all this is a pretty simple, just straight little bracket with a couple holes in it. You're gonna go ahead and find your factory bolt, and you're gonna just put it right into that factory location that you had earlier. And then you have this tab that you took off of that hole there. You're gonna go ahead and take your provided hardware, and you might have to form the hard line a little bit or form this little bracket here. But in this case, I'm gonna fight it up a little bit. And this is full droop, so if you feel like it's a little too tight, it'll be fine once it sits on the ground. But just be very cautious of the hard line and this rubber line here, that you don't want it to leak out. Now that you got your brake line bracket installed, you can go ahead and tighten the frame bolt here, 13mm socket. The bottom one, a 1/2" socket with a 1/2" wrench. And just make sure that's not gonna rub your sway bar when it goes on the ground. Just want to check everything once you set it on the ground. Now that's how you install a BDS 6-inch lift system on this ramp. Now you want to make sure that you do follow our instructions. This video is just kind of a visual aid on how to do that in case you do have any troubles along the way. Now you want to make sure once you get this vehicle on the ground that you torque everything to proper specifications, such as your rear track bar, your rear arms, your lower arms, your struts, and anything else that you might have loosened in this process. And also remember to get in alignment. Now I know you guys are itching to see what this lifted truck looks like. We don't have the wheels and tires for this quite yet, but if you want to hit the link in the description, Cody's going to kind of be showing you how that Dodge looks and rides once it has our 6-inch system on it.